Timothy Ash is an economist and also associate fellow in the Russia and Eurasia program at Chatham House. Also, he is a senior strategist at the RBC BlueBay Asset Management. Welcome to our program, Mr. Ash.
My pleasure.
Former US President Donald Trump criticized President Zelensky and said that Zelensky refused to make a deal. Trump said that any kind of a deal, even the worst one, would have been better than what we have right now regarding Ukraine. Is Donald Trump upset because President Zelensky is not surrendering Ukraine to Vladimir Putin?
Well, I'm not sure former President Trump knows very much about Ukraine, really. He didn't prove himself particularly knowledgeable about Russia, Ukraine. You know, Russia's annexation of Crimea, its invasion of Donbass, and obviously the full-scale invasion. You know, Trump talks a lot. You know, he makes a lot of sound bites, but there's no depth, there's no content. Trump, I think, is just a poodle of Putin. He will do whatever Putin tells him to do. That's kind of the reality. So, I mean, I guess Ukraine has to hope that Trump doesn't win in November. You know, because I guess there would be big concerns about continued US support for it in its effort to defend itself against Russian aggression.
Do you see this new rhetoric from Donald Trump as a sign that he would like to see Russia, but not Ukraine, winning this war?
Well, Trump likes to be friends with autocrats. I don't know what it is about him. He's a sociopath. He, you know, he gets a kick out of bad guys wanting to meet him and shake his hand, you know, whether it's Kim in North Korea, you know, whether it's guys in the Gulf states or, you know, now obviously it's Putin in Russia itself. You know, I think one issue for Ukraine, I guess, is, I mean, Trump has made a lot about how much the US is spending supporting Ukraine. I mean, the numbers are not the $200, $300 billion that Trump has suggested. It's more like 75 billion euros of support, and actually Europe has given more. But the question, if Trump wins, you know, would he really cut off the support? Because a lot of that money that is coming from the US to support Ukraine actually stays in the US, right? It's money that goes to buy US weaponry from US companies in many states that are red states, right, Republican states. So, you know, in the end, this war has been, you know, US has been a big beneficiary of this war through arms sales to Ukraine, but also European countries that are buying a lot more weapons because of the threat from Russia. And the US is a big beneficiary of that. So anyway, let's see what Trump does if he wins the election.
Do you feel that Republicans and Donald Trump understand that it's also beneficial for American weaponry industry? President Zelensky visited ammunition plant in Pennsylvania, but this development caused lots of strange statements from Trump and his inner circle. What is your reaction to this?
Well, look, in the end, there does seem to be bipartisan support from most members of Congress for Ukraine. We saw that eventually when the $61 billion was passed. You know, I think fundamentally, American politicians understand that Russia is the threat to Ukraine. And as I mentioned, the US is a big beneficiary in terms of increased arms sales, etc., to its big defense industries. You mentioned, interestingly, the furor or the noise around Zelensky's visit to Scranton, Pennsylvania, to visit, I think, the 155 millimeter munition plant. I mean, interestingly, Speaker Johnson, Republican Speaker Johnson, didn't make any mention of the fact that Viktor Orban, you know, the Hungarian Prime Minister, has been vocal and has been very partisan in his support for Donald Trump. In fact, Viktor Orban went from the NATO summit in July I think in the US, down to see Trump in Mar-a-Lago for a photo opportunity. So Johnson is himself being very partisan in terms of how he's playing this out. But in the end, you know, US jobs depend on arms industries, defense industry, and I'm not sure the US will be wanting to sell arms to Russia in the future, a big adversary in the end. I think more likely Europe is going to be the big big market for US defense sales. So I think the Trump administration, when it comes to power, will have to think very carefully about how it plays this one.
Well, like also to cover with you economic matter of this question, if Donald Trump decides to stop the aid for Ukraine, what would that mean for the American economy and American ammunition industry, weaponry industry, from your perspective?
Well, like you said, like I said earlier, I should say, the US defense industries are huge, right? And this war has been hugely beneficial for them. I think of the 75 billion euros of US support for Ukraine, probably something around 45 billion euros, about 2/3 have been defense sales that stay in the US, right? They're US jobs. Now, likely you could see it's still a very tight election. The Congress or the US Congress could be split. They maybe will have to think about midterms also, and a lot of those tight local contests in terms of the Congress, depend on those defense jobs. So, I think in the end, Europe has leverage. Europe will have leverage through defense sales, and if Trump pulls away from supporting Ukraine, I think many European countries will say, well, why should we buy arms from Trump and from the US? And actually, European defense purchases from the US are enormous. Hundreds of billions of dollars of arms contracts from Europe every year. And Europe should use its strength. It should say to Donald Trump, if you don't have the same strategic interests as us supporting Ukraine, then we'll go elsewhere. We'll build our own defense procurement. We'll buy it from other people. We won't buy it from the US.
Also, House Speaker Mike Johnson demanded a resignation of Ukrainian ambassador to the United States, Oksana Markarova. Recently, you tweeted that this decision, this resignation, would only work in Putin's favor. What is your further reaction to this?
Look, Oksana has done a superb job. She's probably been one of the best US ambassadors. She was a superb finance minister, and she's done a very, very good job in Washington. And this is about countering Putin, right? So it would be a huge US own goal if Johnson was successful in getting Markarova removed. But actually, Oksana should say, sure, I will resign if the Hungarian ambassador also resigns for Hungarian influence in the US election, which has been much more direct than anything Ukraine has done. Viktor Orban has come out clearly in favor of Trump. He's clearly said that a Trump victory in this election would be the best outcome, right? Zelensky hasn't really said anything like that. So I think, as I said, Oksana's done a great job. It would be a huge shame if she's forced to move from that position.
Do you see this as a witch hunt? And why did they choose to attack our ambassador to the United States? Do you have any insights into it? What is your take on that?
Well, I think it's a bit desperate, really. This reflects that it's a very tight election campaign. Trump is on the back foot. The opinion polls are probably going in Harris's favor. She seems to be winning in key states like Pennsylvania. And it's kind of scraping the barrel from a Republican point of view. We've seen that across the board, right? On the immigration issue, there's no lows that the Republican Party are not prepared to stoop to kind of win this election.
How do you see the influence of this discussion, of this statement angry statement from Republicans? How do you see their influence on this discussion on allowing Ukraine to strike deep inside Russia with Western-made weapons? Could it change the rules of this discussion? Could it influence these big discussions in the White House?
I'm not sure it will. I think clearly the Biden administration is very cautious on the issue. It's not going to, I don't think, even if it agrees to allow Ukraine to use Western missiles to strike deeper into Russia, it's unlikely to announce it this side of elections. Obviously, Putin made some statements yesterday about changing the nuclear doctrine. I think he's, I don't think he's serious. Ultimately, I don't think he wants a a direct war with NATO because he would lose it very quickly. First use of nuclear weapons also would annoy the Chinese, and the Chinese are hugely important to enabling Putin to maintain the Russian economy in this war. I don't think the Chinese will be particularly happy with his comments. So, look, obviously it's a delicate issue. I think there are a lot of negotiations behind the scenes. Obviously, many of the US's European partners are better at reading Putin, I think, and have argued, like the UK, for example, that Ukraine should have the full ability to use the weapons that we supply in whatever way it sees fit. I mean, we've seen comments from the French, the Scandinavian countries, etc. So ultimately, I think eventually, as with everything else in terms of arms supplies to Ukraine, if you think of MiG-29s, T-72s, HIMARS, F-16s, Leopard tanks, eventually the West does what it should do, but unfortunately it does it rather late and delayed. And unfortunately, the result is more casualties for Ukraine. But I think eventually the decision will be made.
What is your assessment of the current state of Russia's economy right now? I mean, its economy and financial system.
Well, look, the only person who knew the war was going to happen was Putin. Putin made that decision. I would argue, he knew what he was going to do many years in advance, right? So he built up Russia's defenses. He deleveraged the economy. He increased foreign exchange reserves. And there was a lot of durability there. So when the West imposed sanctions, he was able to ride through that relatively well. The West has probably not done enough. There needs to be more secondary sanctions. Lots of countries have benefited and enabled Russia to circumvent the sanctions. Sanctioned regimes, whether it's Venezuela or Iraq or Iran, they can survive a long time, right? I mean, they and especially a regime like Russia, which is an authoritarian regime, it can divert resources from consumption to defense. So there's a lot of durability there. Interestingly, today we saw the Financial Times front page article that Saudi Arabia is going to move away from its $100 oil price target, increase production, which would suggest lower oil prices. And that would be very damaging if that is the reality. If we're going into a period of significantly lower oil prices, I think that will be very damaging to the Russian economy and Russia's ability to continue to wage this war. I wonder if it was a message from Saudi Arabia to Putin, end this war now while oil prices are still relatively high. They're going a lot lower and you're going to be in a much more difficult position.
Also, how do you see the main harmful consequences for Russian economy made by the Western sanctions? How painful they are right now for Vladimir Putin?
Well, not painful enough. I mean, that's the reality. Then we need to do more. We need to be more aggressive on sanctions. Ultimately, we need to reduce the revenue stream to Putin's regime to be able to maintain this war. So I'd say more secondary sanctions. I think the MOEX sanctions we saw a couple of months ago is making it increasingly difficult, actually, for Russia to transact with countries like Turkey, the Gulf states, and China. Consequences have been, it's lower growth and higher inflation, right? And difficult decisions made, like, move from consumption to defense spending. Ultimately, the longer the war goes on, I think more difficult choices will need to be made. And living standards eventually in Russia will be compromised as a result. Russia will have to pay a lot more to import goods, and export prices will be a lot lower. So, as I said, sanctioned regimes last a long time. Doesn't mean they have a great outlook, and it's a good sort of economic outturn. But unfortunately, as I said, countries can survive quite a long time.
If the war in Ukraine continues for a while, when can Russian economy begin to crumble?
Well, it's very hard calling that. As I said, oil prices are probably key. And if we see oil prices drop significantly because of this Saudi move, remember, global growth is pretty weak. US economy is slowing. Fed's been forced to cut rates. China is in a terrible situation. The outlook for oil and commodity prices is not great. And that, I think, will have a pretty significant effect on Russia. It will undermine commodity revenues, and it will make Putin have to make much more difficult decisions, I think.
You mentioned about the Chinese state of economy. How could this bad situation for China influence their economic cooperation with Russia?
Well, look, my view is that, China was not particularly happy about Russia's invasion of Ukraine. What China wants is stable global markets and globalization. And Putin's attack risked commodity and energy price spike. It risked disruption to global markets. I think that's, the Chinese don't particularly like that. And, also this risk of perhaps Russian first use of nuclear weapons. Again, that would have a major impact on global markets. Chinese don't want that. So I think the messaging for China will probably to Putin will be careful what you do. Don't do anything that impacts on us particularly. And maybe it's a good time to think about drawing the war to a conclusion.
Also, Reuters reported that Ukraine would like to see India as a mediator for try to a peaceful settlement of this war. What is your take on that?
Well, unfortunately, the global South has been quite disappointing in reality in terms of its support for Ukraine. I mean, countries like India and South Africa have been very vocal, for example, in support of Palestinians in the war in Gaza, etc., and obviously the genocide case lodged at the International Court, which has some justification, but they've been less eager to recognise Russia's genocide against Ukraine. And it's kind of double standards from those countries. They've been quick to complain about the negative economic impacts of the war, initially anyway, through higher food and energy prices. But actually, at the same time, they've not been willing really to call out who's the aggressor. The aggressor is Russia. Those energy and food prices were higher because of Russia's actions, Russia's invasion. And interesting, if you think about India, India has actually been a big beneficiary from the war. It's been able to negotiate cheap energy deals from Russia. Probably the net benefit to Indian economy has been something like $40-50 billion through cheaper energy imports because of the Western oil price cap. And there are many other countries that have also benefited. That you can think of the Gulf states, Turkey, Central Asia, Southern Caucasus countries. They've seen huge capital outflows from Russia. It's supported their currencies. It's allowed policy rates to be reduced, and they've been able to run higher growth and higher and sustainable growth. And a lot of those countries have stayed on the sidelines, right? They've not really spoken up in favor of Ukraine, which is disappointing, despite the fact that they've actually been benefiting from the war.
How can the West influence this situation from your perspective? At least, can the West do anything with that? Does the West have enough leverage on this situation to change this game?
Well, in terms of those third countries that are supporting sanctions evasion, I think the West has a lot of possibilities to do things. Secondary sanctions, sanction more companies that have been found to be circumventing sanctions, whether it's in Turkey, whether it's in Central Asia, whether it's in the Gulf states, wherever, internationally in India. Make it crystal clear that if you try and break the sanctions and help Russia, you yourself will be sanctioned. You will be cut off from dollar markets. You will make we can make life very difficult for you. We're seeing that now. We're seeing some greater effort by the West to impose secondary sanctions on those kind of individuals and companies, but we could certainly do more. We have a lot of leverage, right? The other leverage is actually through arms sales, if you think about it. The war has proven that Western military technology is far better than Russian technology. So, a lot of countries, if you think of Pakistan, or you think of Turkey, or you think of India, they're desperate to buy defense technology. We can restrict our supplies or sales of defense technology to those countries unless they come in on our side in this war that Ukraine is waging in defense against Russia, right? We've got lots of leverage if we want to. I mean, I think ultimately it's a political will. We need a reality check from Western countries that Russia is the primary threat to us, that our best defense against that is Ukraine. And we need to do everything we can to help Ukraine to win this war. Now, that means tightening up on sanctions. It means going, for example, after frozen Russian assets. It's $330 billion of immobilized Russian central bank assets in Western banks. We can take all of that. We can take the capital, not just the interest. We can give that to Ukraine so it can fund its own defense and fund its own recovery and reconstruction. There's probably overall around $400 billion of immobilized Russian assets in our banks. That's a lot of money. That's twice Ukrainian GDP. That could go a long, long way to helping Ukraine win this war.
What is your take on the possibility of peaceful negotiations between Ukraine and Russia on the peace deal, or at least on a ceasefire?
Look, it might sound strange, but I am relatively optimistic. And I'm relatively optimistic because, both sides, I think, have proven they can last for a long war. A lot of people say Putin has the advantage, he can outlast the West. I'm not sure he can outlast Ukrainians, because Ukrainians have no choice. They are fighting a war for survival against a country that is waging genocide against it. So it has no choice but to fight, right? And even if Donald Trump cut off arms sales to Ukraine, I think Europe would be forced to continue to help Ukraine and arm Ukraine. And Ukrainians, I think, will continue to fight, right? And I just don't think that Putin has the ability to take and hold the whole of Ukraine. If you look 2.5 years on from the full-scale invasion, he's only got something like 10% more of territory. He's not been able to take and hold the whole of Ukraine. So I think ultimately Putin would probably accept some kind of deal or some kind of negotiation. And I think from the Ukrainian side, in the end, I don't think a long war necessarily suits Ukraine as well. The Ukrainian leadership and population care more about their populations and people than I think Russia does. But I think ultimately Ukraine may have to make some hard choices. I think perhaps we could think about a scenario where Russia withdraws to where it was in February 22, just before the full-scale invasion. We have negotiations around the long-term future of Crimea and DPR and LPR. I'm not saying Ukraine accepts their loss, but discussions about their future. Does Ukraine want the speedy reintegration of Crimea and DPR and LPR to their political process? Funding those areas' reconstruction will be very expensive. Their populations, I think, have been subject to Russian propaganda. Will probably vote for pro-Russian parties if they're immediately reinstated into Ukraine. So maybe some discussion around the long-term framework. And I think Ukraine needs some security guarantees, whether or not it's NATO membership. But certainly, Ukraine needs to be assured that it will be supplied with whatever it needs to defend itself from a conventional perspective. So the full spectrum of Western technology. So Ukraine is, we think of Ukraine as kind of a South Korea scenario where, it's able to build, or an Israel-style scenario where it has the best Western technology, and it has a military technological superiority over Russia that Russia does not want to try this again if possible. So, I think there are scenarios where both sides realize that there isn't a speedy solution. The long war doesn't particularly help each side. And maybe there are some avenues for a negotiation here.
Do you feel that the West is ready to provide Ukraine with bold security guarantees, defense pact, or membership in NATO?
Well, unfortunately, on NATO membership, there are clearly some countries who, frankly, are cowards. No other way to explain it. Don't really understand the threat from Russia. The political reality is that there will be some opponents in Europe, right, to that, and even in the US. I think a better argument for Ukraine is this idea of, to be a top partner to NATO, have some strategic relationship that assures it is able to get the best technology, the best military technology, the best assurances in terms of munition supplies, so it can defend itself, right? As with Israel, as with South Korea, etc. So a similar relationship to those. as a minimum, I would say. And obviously NATO membership would be great if possible. But I think Ukraine needs assurances that we can ensure its security going forward, so much so that Ukraine can get back on with recovery and reconstruction.
But would the West be capable of providing Ukraine with such security guarantees if, for example, Donald Trump is in the White House?
Well, Europe now is massively increasing its defense spending and capability, right? I mean, look at what Poland is doing. I think there are many countries in Europe that do realize the threat from Russia, realize that Ukraine is the best way to stop Russia, and that we need, this idea of Ukraine's security guarantees, actually we're talking about Europe's security, right? So I think we all have an interest in Europe in making sure Ukraine is able to defend itself. I'm British. I think the UK government, the UK population are very clear who is the aggressor here, who is our ally, and who we should ensure should win and should be able to defend itself and actually be a frontline defense for us. So I think there's enough realization in Europe, whatever happens with Trump, that Ukraine will be provided with enough to defend itself.
And my final question for you, do you feel any kind of Ukraine's fatigue in Europe right now?
Look, I can only really talk about the UK, and in the UK I don't see any fatigue particularly, right? I mean, if you look at the opinion polls, still very strong support for Ukraine. If you look at, we've had a change of government here. The new government is as supportive of Ukraine as the previous government. We certainly recognize that Russia is the biggest threat. Maybe it helps that we've suffered the Russian use of weapons of mass destruction twice on UK soil, the Litvinenko issue and then the Salisbury attack. So we absolutely are clear in terms of Russia is the threat. Ukrainians are helping us. Your defense, the way Ukrainians have so bravely fought to defend themselves, you're also fighting to defend us, and we really, really appreciate that. So certainly in the UK, I'm encouraged. I think we see the similar kind of understanding, I think, in Scandinavia. The Finns, the Swedes, the Danes, I think, get it and understand it. Obviously, in emerging Europe, the Poles are also, I think, pretty understanding of the threat, even the Romanians. There are a few weak points, obviously. Hungary is a weak point, Slovakia. We have populist governments, I think, that have been infiltrated by Russian interests. There are obviously vulnerability. But I think there are enough countries in Europe that understand the threat that are not going to roll over and will continue to support Ukraine.
And how can the West deal with Russia after the end of this war?
Well, whatever happens, I think the West needs to be very careful about its relationship. I mean, there's no going back to business as usual. There would need to be a total change in terms of the leadership and the mindset in Russia. I think Timothy Schneider, who I think most of your listeners will know very well, makes a very good case that the problem with this war is not just about Putin. It's about the Russian population, right? And they haven't got over their colonial past. They still think Russia is this colonial empire. I'm British. I mean, we suffered some defeats, if you think about the Suez Crisis in the 1950s, that made us understand that we have no colonial future. We have to move on. We have to work in a cooperative manner with other countries, like we did with the European Union, at least until a few years back, in terms of ensuring our own economic prosperity and our security.
Thank you, Mr. Resch, for your time and for supporting Ukraine, and glory to Ukraine.
Slava Ukraini, yeah?
Героям слава. Thank you very much.
My pleasure.